you would like to turn to, I would like to turn to Ezra chapter 10. Ezra chapter 10. So today is actually going to be our last class in Ezra. Next Sunday, Tristan is going to, I told Tristan he has to do the entire book of Nehemiah next Sunday. So we'll just see what he does with that. He's going to overview Nehemiah, kind of take us in a little bit more forward-looking direction, coming off of our study in Ezra. So my plan, we're going to look at Ezra 10 and finish that up. And then, as time permits, we're going to also look at Nehemiah 8 and kind of cap, in a sense, Ezra's story this morning. So that's like kind of our goal for our time this morning. Let's do a word of prayer before we get started. Let's pray with me. Great and mighty Lord and our Father in heaven, thank you so much, Lord, for bringing us together today in safety. Thank you for giving us this incredible opportunity, once again, that we don't ever want to take for granted, of studying your word, trying to understand your mind more, trying to see things through your eyes, Lord, so that we can be better examples of your Son Jesus in the lives that we live. Thank you for giving us this time that we've had over these many weeks to study Ezra. And I pray, Lord, that we'll take applications from it, put them to work in our own lives, so that we can be better disciples in your name and spread the gospel in a way that glorifies and honors you. This is our prayer in your Son Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so Ezra chapter 10, and remember that at this point, kind of where are we? Like, what's the current kind of situation we're dealing with here, based on Ezra chapter 9?
Ezra's come back and he's found really Israel in a state of sin and disarray. And we leave off with Ezra going to God, basically just asking for God to do what he thinks should be done.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so Ezra has made the journey back from Persia to Jerusalem, and like almost as soon as he gets back, the people come to him and say, well, there is a problem, right? We've all intermarried, and it's not just the people, it's also some of the Levites, it's also some of the priests, it's also some of the leaders. So it's systemic, and so this is a big deal because obviously God commanded them, really since Moses at Mount Sinai, that he didn't want them intermarrying with the people of the land because they would bring in their sin, their wicked practices, and corrupt them. And so chapter 9, as Jack said, is really, the bulk of chapter 9 is really just Ezra's prayer to God, responding to the situation and really pouring his heart out and just basically saying, you know what, God, our guilt in this matter is so significant that I'm just going to leave it up to you, right? And then you do what you need to do to us. And so that's going to turn the page for us into chapter 10, because chapter 9 really just ends with Ezra's prayer. And so just to level set us again before we look at chapter 10, right? So this is kind of the timeline of what we've seen and looked at already. We saw the initial return at the very beginning of Ezra, and the people came back with Zerubbabel mainly to rebuild the temple. The temple was completed. Ezra came back in chapter 7, and what was Ezra's purpose in returning? What did he say that he had a mind and a heart to do when he returned? Yeah, okay. To study the law, to teach the law, to do the law. He's all about the law, so that's kind of his goal, is to do that. What follows, right, is from Ezra is going to be Nehemiah, who will return after this, with the goal to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and then just see some historical markers, right? It's about 100 years or so after Nehemiah that Alexander the Great will be in power and the whole Grecian Empire, and then a couple hundred years beyond that is going to be the Jewish Maccabean revolt. So that kind of hopefully gives us a little bit of marker where we are in history. And if you think back to it and remember, you can kind of shovel that in with our study in Daniel, where we talked about kind of a progression of the nations of the world. But this is where we are in chapter 10 of Ezra, as we flip over here. And so the very first thing we're going to see in Ezra chapter 10 is a confession that comes about here. Okay, and so what's the circumstance here? Very first thing it says in chapter 10. What's happening?
Marriage, intermarriage.
Okay, so the intermarriage. Ezra has prayed about that, and then what's kind of the response?
Okay, so chapter 10, verse
Right. Well, Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept.
I think it's way too much. What have we read that Ezra's done up to this point?
Are you talking about him laying on his face and crying at the temple?
I mean, he's praying.
Okay.
That's how he prayed, right? His demeanor.
But all he's done so far, really, is pray. All right, that's it. He hasn't even had a chance to crack open the book of the law like he wanted to do. And so I want you to see this. This is really important for us that chapter 10 and what follows is all response to Ezra publicly praying. That's really all he's done. He's come back, he's laid everything open before God, and it's public, to Jen's point, right? It says he's cast himself down before the house of God, before the temple. So he's in the sight of everyone, and you can kind of picture this in your mind that as he does this, and he's weeping, and he's just groaning with this, the people are kind of gravitating towards this. Like, what's going on over at the temple, right? That guy who just showed up again, Ezra, he's just making a scene. And more as the people come together, they start to weep bitterly at the end of verse 1. Okay, so they get it, right? They understand also the purpose here, what Ezra is upset about, and it affects them too. So they too now are involved in this, and they've been convicted, right? To see how egregious their sin has been. All right, and you can see the admission of that after this great multitude gathers. It says in verse 2, Shechaniah the son of Jehiel, the sons of Elam, addressed Ezra, and he says, "We have broken faith with our God." He will go on to describe that, and that's one of the phrases we pointed out in our last class that started really back in chapter 9. But you see this a handful of times, 5 or 6 times throughout chapters 9 and 10, that there is a phrase that either says that the people are being faithless, or Ezra is calling out their faithlessness, or someone will say, we have broken faith, or the people have broken faith, right? And just illustrating that point that it's not just we made some bad life choices. This is like affecting our relationship with God. Right? That's the severity of what has happened here, okay? And so the people show up here with Ezra, they confess their sin, and how would you describe what follows after that, right? What starts with Shechaniah here, conversing with Ezra? Chris?
That's okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So you're saying they would be faithless.
Yeah.
The way my version, the version I'm reading here says it's forsaken or trespass. And I would say those are synonymous. If we disobey God, then we're faithless.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right?
We can get into this, and I suspect maybe this was where Israel was, right? That we can just say, well, maybe my faith right now is not so great. But I love that, right? That another way to read this is like God expects faithfulness, and if you aren't being faithful, it's transgression, right? It's not just, well, I'm just not at my best today. Like God, Ezra, the people even are convicted in this matter. It's like, okay, it's all or nothing, right? We've got to do this, or we're transgressing. Okay, good. I forgot what I asked. What's kind of the conversation that happens here from Shechaniah talking to Ezra? What does he kind of bring up at this point as he approaches it?
Right.
Okay, so he said, this is great, all right? So again, all that Ezra has done really is pray. And yet, there's a great multitude of people. They're emotional about this. They're convicted about this. And Shechaniah comes up and says, okay, we're gonna make this right. Okay. And what stands out to you, though, about what he says specifically, right? He could have just said that, right? Don't worry, we're going to fix this. But he's a little bit more detailed than that to our benefit, right? And in looking at this, how does he describe how we're going to fix it? Okay, right? Doug is included into a key phrase there, verse 3, right? He says, therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children, all right? So they are serious. You can't be an Old Testament Jew and throw around the word covenants lightly. It's a big deal. Like they are saying, I'll tell you what, to fix this, let's re-enter into an agreement with God himself and hold ourselves accountable so that this gets addressed the right way. Okay, big deal, right? So they're going to covenant with God. What else do you see here in his language that he uses?
For Israel, in spite of this, relationship, even though the Israelites didn't take long to make the same exact mistakes they were making previously, I think they understand that this is a new era where God is promised with his people. And I also love what he says in verse 4, arise, for it is your task, and we are with you. Right? And so we kind of see that image that we've seen in the past of all Israel. Like, that we all messed up, and we're all going to fix it together. We're with you.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So first thing he says is, listen, this is bad. There is hope. All right. So that's very key. Right. This is not the end of the world. It's bad, but there is hope that we can fix this. All right. They're going to make a covenant with God. And then you see, as Abigail mentioned in verse 4, talking to Ezra, he says, arise, get up, for it is your task, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. So almost immediately, again, because Ezra prayed, right, all the people, kind of led by Shechaniah, are like united with Ezra. It's like, okay, you came here to teach the law. Get up and teach the law. Like, tell us what to do to fix this. We're ready to fix this. We're going to make an agreement with God to fix this. We're going to do this thing. All right. The very last thing you see here in chapter 10, verse 5, is then Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel take an oath that they would do as had been said. So they took the oath. Okay. So again, this isn't just words. All right. They say we can make a covenant, and Ezra says, great, we're going to make a covenant, and that's what he does. And he binds them into this covenant. Okay. So even as we get to the end of these first few verses here in this chapter, we have seen just a tremendous response from the people and a dedication, right? I mean, they're set. This isn't just mere words. They've taken action. They're ready to address this. They're ready to correct the sin and the transgression. Okay? So let's start to chapter 10. All right? So now I want us to look at we just covered all this. I want us to look at the execution now of what they've done. So they've decided, they've made a covenant, they've entered into oath here, they're ready to act, but now let's talk about, like, okay, how are they going to act? What does it look like now that they're going to execute these plans here, all right? And what I want us to just notice here is, as we look through this, while the situation is bad, I would suggest this is probably recorded for the generations after, for us too, because it's supposed to encourage and instruct us. Okay, so we should be looking at this in a sense like, okay, when things are really bad, how do you fix them, right? And it starts with this commitment, right, to do the right thing, and it moves into action, though. Okay, so what we see here as we progress from chapter 10, verse 5, is the reactions, right, and the responses here that are going to come about in the text. The first one we just talked about is that in response to all this, Ezra binds the Levites to an oath, and they take it. Okay, so Ezra and them, they're all saying, okay, we're doing this, right? The priests, the Levites, the people, they're ready for that. What's another reaction that you see following? What else do they do to kind of start putting things into action after they bind themselves to an oath? Proclamation. Okay, so this is where, it's way more difficult to not do something after you've told everybody about it publicly. Okay, and I'm not saying that this is some sort of, business principle or anything to take away from here. I'm just saying that there's something to do this, that the next thing they do is they say, okay, listen, everyone, we're going to fix this. It's really difficult then to change your mind after you told everybody in the kingdom that we're going to do one thing to not do it. Okay? So in a sense, they're making it public and expressing intention, but they're also kind of just doing one more thing that holds them accountable to how they're going to address the situation. Okay? The last thing I would point out to in this particular idea here, in terms of what they did in reaction to this, is that we get down after they've made the proclamation that everyone should assemble to take care of the matter in verse 9. It says, then all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days. It was the 9th month on the 20th day of the month. And all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. Okay? So the proclamation is everybody's got to show up here in 3 days so we can fix the issue. And the weather is not good. Okay? And it says that everyone shut up. And they were trembling there. And I don't know, it makes you chuckle a little bit. It's all very important for us to see that they're there trembling, not just because they're cold and wet, but because they understand the gravity of the situation and the nature of the sin. Also is part of this. Okay? And so, again, they didn't look at that and say, well, like, can we have another day because it's raining today? Right? Or can we push it off a week when the weather gets better? They committed and they did it despite, in this case, the bad weather. All right, which sounds a little, so what? But I don't think they all had umbrellas with them or anything like that. I think they're just sitting out there getting soaked. Okay, but because they've committed, they're following through with the commitment. Okay, and then, so then they have this back and forth here when Ezra stands up and tells them again, in verse 10, you've all broken faith. Are you sure you're ready to do this? They confess it again. And then in verse 12 is where we see that then all the assembly answered Ezra with a loud voice, it is so. In other words, we've sinned, we've violated God's law. We must do as you have said. All right, and so then we get this public assent. All right, Ezra has already bound everyone in oath, and now everyone who's gathered together says together publicly, okay, we're going to do it. All right, so we don't just get like one flavor of commitment. Right? I mean, it's just like a few different ways in which Ezra is convicting, the people are assenting, or binding themselves, or admitting, or confessing. I mean, they are all very heavily locked in. We are going to fix this situation no matter what. Okay? So, when we talk about how they're carrying this out, okay? Because what do they kind of come away with? They say, we're going to fix this, and we're committed to fixing this. Yeah, can't agree.
Thinking it along with the passage that they said there's going to be consequences if you don't. That's right. Do what we do.
Right? They're accountable too, right? That's the proclamation. If you in the 3 days, like, we're going to take all your stuff. Okay, you're going to release for it. Okay. So yeah, they understood the consequences. So how are they going to, Chris, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Another consequence is that they would be separated from the assembly.
Yeah.
Which would be a pretty big deal since they had traveled so far to get there.
Yeah.
But I wonder about these things, and maybe you'll cover it, but how many of these things still that day now,
Yeah. That's really interesting that you bring that up as one of the consequences that they would be separated from the assembly, because that should have already happened, right? And that's the whole thing. If you're going to go and marry into the sinful and wicked nations of the land, that was not supposed to be tolerated, right? But instead, for whatever reason, we don't know explicitly, but they had just allowed it and allowed it and allowed it. And so then we get to this point, I think we maybe mentioned this briefly last class, where it's almost like you need Ezra as an outsider to show up and say, what is happening? Like, how
like they've kind of stepped back into God's law. Okay, yeah, that's right. Let's fix this, and now we are going to double down on this, right? We're gonna cull out anyone who is not willing to serve God together with us, right?
It did absolutely give him a chance to repent.
The key point here is that we could read this and say, oh, Ezra is here to clean house, and he's not taking any chances here, and he's not taking no. But he and God through him is offering up another form of repentance, right? Which we have seen so often from God over and over with his people. So pretty extraordinary that we see that.
We're involved in this too.
The priests were involved in this too, right? And that's really key.
Because we have seen that too throughout Ezra, that the priests have not always been on the level, right? It seems like we've seen there's a problem with the priests. Like we don't know who's the priest. Some priests show up and they don't have a lineage of their family, so they can't serve as priests. And Ezra wants to come back and there's no Levites with him to be priests, right? And so it's a little squirrely when we think that the people, the priests, who should be the ones who are just driving the law home, have not only not really been driving the law home, but now are also culpable in transgressing the law. But to Doug's point, now we see them, they're invested, right? So now Ezra has kind of righted the ship, and the priests, everybody's kind of coming along here and saying, yeah, we got to do this, right? So they're involved in it too. Ken, would you comment?
The consequences of taking your stuff is probably not that terrible, but when you think about it, they're families. This is their family, and so if they're thrown out of the group, then they've got nobody else to turn to.
Right.
You're on your own.
Yeah, and remember, this is not, Israel at this point is not this strong nation, right? It's not like, oh, okay, I'll get thrown out of my family. I'll just head up north or wherever, and I'll find a new place. Like, they are still fragile, right? There's still no wall around the city at this point. They're still able to be conquered again. So the consequences are even more dire in that regard. If I get thrown out here, I have nowhere to go, right? So yeah, right. There's some very severe consequences going on. Okay, so how are they going to fix the situation? What do they say? This is how we need to do this.
Okay.
Right. So I just love this so much. That's probably because I'm a organizational freak. But I love this part, right? Where so in verse 12, right, where they make they say, "It is so. We must do as you have said, but the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open, nor is this a task for one day or two, for we have greatly transgressed in this matter. Let our officials stand for the whole assembly." In verse 14, "Let all in our cities who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times, and with them the elders and judges of every city, until the fierce wrath of our God over this matter is turned away from us." Okay, so I love that, all right? So they don't just say, and there's a lot to, we could do a whole bunch of stuff here about setting goals appropriately. They don't just say, yeah, great, okay, let's just dig in here and weed out everybody and figure it out. And they say, okay, here's what we need to do, right? Because logistically speaking, it's a big job. We can't just stand here in the rain, Ezra, and take care of it. And they build a plan, okay, in order to execute this, in order to get back. And you see it a couple of times in the text. They make a point of saying, we need to do this because we have transgressed greatly. Because we need to stave off God's wrath. We've got to get this done, and this is the best way to do it. How long does it take to do this?
They don't argue with the facts of the matter. I mean, that's right. While they offer up an alternative plan for execution of correction, they're not trying to dig in and say, oh, wait a minute, we're not really guilty.
Right. Yeah. This is like shuffling off or pointing fingers anywhere else. Like, they're owning it for sure, right? Which is what we saw. You remember in his prayer, he wasn't even guilty and he owned it, right? He's like, we did this and we've transgressed, we've sinned. So the people are, in a sense, following suit. How long does it take him to fix it? About 3 months. Okay, so I didn't spend a lot of time processing that. That seems like a long time. Like 3 months to fix sin probably speaks to just how widespread it was. And the text kind of speaks to that. It wasn't just a few people, it was a lot of people, leaders of the people, the spiritual leaders of the people. Everyone's involved. But at the same time, I think it's trying to tell us that there was they did it, right? They started, they finished, and the time it took was like the most efficient time that they could spend on, right? Adam, did you have a
It seems like a very official thing. Yeah. I almost assumed that there was a record keeper saying, this guy did it, this guy did it, and we'll check off and they separated, sort of thing. I don't know what came from that, but like they're serious.
Yeah.
No, I think that's exactly right. This is a very official sounding section of Scripture, right? And I think to your point, I mean, we'll just segue into that, right? That leads us into verses 18 through the end of the chapter, right? And what is verses 18 through the end of the chapter?
It's like a badge.
Genealogy, right? So we've focused on that a lot. We look at Chronicles on Wednesdays, we look at Ezra on Sundays, and we've seen this multiple times, lists of people's names, right, for one reason or another. And when we've looked through Ezra, the point we've made on that is that it's almost like when they list a bunch of people's names, it's almost like this marker to say, hey, something important is getting ready to happen. Like we're moving into a new phase here, right? The list of exiles that returned back in the beginning of Ezra, the list of exiles that returned with Ezra in chapter 8, right? Those things are listed there almost to say, look, we're starting another phase of us returning God, right? Well, so then what's the deal as we get to the end of Ezra? And Ezra just says, great, I'm going to write down the names of everybody who's in sin. That seems like a really bummer way to end the book. So why do you think that they did that?
And there has to be accountability. I mean, they've all made this covenant to free themselves of a sinful relationship, but somebody's going to have to keep track of what's actually happened. And I mean, what I think you can't discount here is that they were married. I mean, you're talking about people's spouses that whether or not they should have been in that relationship in the first place, there is a deep emotional attachment, most likely with many of these people. Mm-hmm. And so that's not something to the point of the people that you just say, all right, well, sorry, you gotta go. Like it's difficult. It's a process, and there's going to be inevitably people who want to go back. They want to take their wife or their husband back, and they want to restore their relationship because, physically they miss them or emotionally they miss them, and that going forward there has to be someone to say, no, I mean, we know you were in sin, you made a covenant to not do that anymore.
Yeah. Jennifer.
And sort of from the other side of that, 'cause I agree with everything Jack said, but also this is God's way of doing things. And it is an honor to these people to say, here's a record of those who repented. Is that not what the book of life is about us? God is writing down my name. Here's one that repented, and your name. So this is God's way of doing things.
I think this is key. Okay, we can't
At the end of Ezra and look at this and say, well, it's just a list of sinners. I mean, it's a list of forgiven, right? This is a list of penitents, people whose names are recorded here. And you can see, you kind of, again, I get it, that Ezra ends on like it's a little bit of a downer to read it because to Jack's point, we understand, at least conceptually, this is an emotional thing. This is not just like one and done, and but you can see here in these last few, verse 19, they pledged themselves to put away their wives, and their guilt offering was the ram of the flock for their guilt. And then you get to the very end in verse 44. All these have married foreign women, and some of the women had even born children. Okay, again, this is not an easy thing to fix. The consequences of this are deep and expansive, and it's the point being made here in some degree is, do you understand what these people did to get back and be right with God?
Wait a minute, Jim.
Yeah, what happened? Right, we don't know. Right, we don't know. Phil?
It can be human nature at times, we kind of alluded to this, but to downplay sin by saying, oh, well, everybody sins. You don't see that attitude here. It is a very serious response.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things. The sin complicates. It doesn't just, it's not just the person who does the sin. It doesn't just affect that person. Especially when marriage is involved, you have these other consequences that are awful. And I think one reason why we have this, I love the idea of all these people repented. What a great thing. It's also about, it's cautionary about to us. How does this apply to us? I mean, are we sinning because this can happen? I mean, awful things can happen. Another thing is, to Doug's point, I take some comfort on behalf of these pagan wives and children that God looked out for Ishmael and his mom, I can't remember his mom's name, but God helps with that.
Yeah, no, great
That's
comment.
right. We talked about that a couple times before in the past. The sin is very sticky, right? And like you don't, that's part of the lie is that I can sin and, okay, if I get caught or whatever, like I'll just fix that and that will be the end of it. The reality is, no, sin has consequences that stick to other things and other people. And we're seeing it played out here as a cautionary tale, right? Which is not a new message. I mean, we have the whole life of David to give us the same cautionary tale that you can't sin and think it only affects you. So we have this from these people too, though. Same really idea going on. Okay? All right. Let's flip over to Nehemiah chapter 8 now, because we're not exactly done with the story of Ezra, right? Because remember Ezra's goal, he stated it, he said, I wanted to go back and study the law and teach the law and do the law. I wanted to do all these things. And unfortunately, when we get to the end of Ezra, we haven't exactly seen him really do that except to enforce the law in one way. Yes, sir.
One thing before we leave that
Absolutely,
section, even today, marriage can be sinful, it can be ungodly, and this is what has to happen as everything.
It's a great,
And when you think about it that way, that marriage is from God, and yet we can bring sin into the equation. We said about so many things, right? And make things that even are from God into something that they're not intended to be. And again, get the consequences of that, the fix sometimes, which is messy too. So yeah, again, the cautionary tale there is important. Good. Okay. All right. So we're heading over to Nehemiah now, chapter 8, because now we're going to see. I want us to end by seeing the success of Ezra and his mission. Okay. So by the time we get into Nehemiah 8, most likely the Nehemiah has returned. We'll talk more about him next Sunday. He has led the people. They've rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, so that's happened. So if you think about the restoration in three parts, right? The temple, the wall, we're 2/3 of the way there at this point in Nehemiah. The temple's built, the wall is built. The law is still a little sketchy in terms of whether or not it has, we've restored the people to it. But so we're going to stand here to Nehemiah because Ezra and Nehemiah are to a degree contemporary. And so what I want us to do first is look at chapter 7. So you can maybe just look back a few verses here. Chapter 7 of Nehemiah, verse 73. And what time is it?
the 7th month. And so I am leaning on you to have paid attention in prior classes. Why do we care about the 7th month? A lot of feasts. It's a very holy month. Okay? We saw it back in Ezra.
If they got back And they kind of got going in the beginning there with the first remnant, and lo and behold, it was the seventh month. Oh, it's the time for us to celebrate God in all these different ways according to the Jewish calendar. And so here we are again. Now more progress has been made, and lo and behold, before we get into chapter 8, it is once again the seventh month, a very holy month to the people. Okay, and so this is where in chapter 8, verse 1, it says, all the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. Okay, so the very first thing that I'm going to point out here to us is, I give credit to Marissa on this one, is the way that the law is described. How do they describe the law? What do they call it? Which is not really what we always hear, right? It's just the law, or God's law, or the Ten Commandments, or whatever, right? So this phrase is a little bit different, okay? It's not the most common phrase we hear about the law. And here's the thing, if you look through the entirety of chapter 8, and even in chapter 9, you know what you're going to see here is it talks about, it calls the law by name over and over and over throughout this chapter. Okay? It starts in verse 1, you can see it there, verse 3, the book of the law, verse 5, the book, verse 7, the law, verse 8, the law of God, verse 9, the words of the law, verse 12, the words, verse 13, the words of the law, verse 14, the law, verse 18, the book of the law of God. And then you get into chapter 9, verse 3, and it says the book of the law of the Lord their God. So guess what this chapter is about? It's about the law, okay? And that was what Ezra came back to do. And guess what? It's all throughout this chapter. So this is not coincidental in any way. We are reading the account of, like, okay, what are we going to do with the law here? Okay, and so they call Ezra, law, come out here, read the law to us. And you can see, I love that we see here the reverence for the law, right? Like for the literal book, okay, is what you see here. It says in verse 4, they had built a platform for this purpose, so that Ezra could go stand on the platform and be above the people and read the law. Like they did work so that the reading of the law could be facilitated. Okay, good.
It's time for me to ask a question.
Okay.
Have they not observed it all the time they were in captivity? Do we have any evidence of them studying the law, except things that they had from the prophets or Jeremiah or there's evidence that they had not read the law?
That's a great question. I'm gonna actually come back to that in just a minute. A great question. Okay. I want to just flesh up this point for us, right? So they built a platform. What happened when Ezra opened the literal book of the law? What did people do? They stood up, okay, in the reading of the law. I love that. It says in verse 6, Ezra blessed the Lord. The people agreed. The people all say amen. And it says they lifted their hands, right, when he did that. It says verse 6, again, they bowed their heads and worshipped. The Levites, who again, we've made this point formerly, have been a little sketchy and a little questionable in how much they're adhering to the law. They're the ones who are out among the people helping them understand as Ezra is reading. Verse 8 says that the people understood. That's great. And what did they do? Because they understood verse 9.
They're sorry because they wept. Yeah.
So again, this is one of those passages where I don't know how many times I've read it, and you can't read it without really stopping at the end there. They just heard somebody reading the Bible and just started crying. And we're given to understand that, like, they're upset. It's not because they're happy. It's not tears of joy. They are upset and they are touched because they understand and hearing the words that we are guilty of this. Okay? And this is going to lead us to Doug's question here. Like, okay, like how well acquainted were they with the law? It's a difficult question to answer, okay? Because what's going to happen here is it's the seventh month, And the rest of the chapter, the back half of the chapter, is going to focus on the fact that they're going to go and celebrate the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. Okay? And how does it describe this particular Feast of Booths? What does it say about it in text?
Okay, so that's number one. They found it written, and it's almost like, oh, they discovered it, right? Like, oh, did you know that there was? So, okay, so there's some sort of discovery piece here, okay? But also, how does it say that they celebrated it? Again, go ahead.
Well, I just, in the verse that you pointed out, where it was the 7th month, and all that, at the end of that verse, it says, and all the people were in their cities, which made me think, if this is the big feast month, aren't all the people supposed to be in Jerusalem? But obviously they were not.
Yes.
So I think that was our first clue that they have some idea.
Right. No, I think you're right. So,
And this is just me. You can totally throw this away if you want to later, right? I feel like there is probably some surface level idea about the law, like, oh yeah, there's some commandments and some feasts and things like that. But there is definitely a gap between what we understand about the law and what we're doing about the law. Right? And I think that comes out here in this passage for sure. And in fact, again, I mean, that's Ezra's purpose. Ezra says, I'm going to go back and I'm going to teach them the law. Well, he wouldn't have to do that because they're already doing the law, right? So even Ezra in Persia knows that something is missing back home, and I can do this. I can fill in that gap, right? Now that said, Daniel, he's in captivity. He's studying the law. Ezra is over in Persia. He's studying the law. Like, that's his whole job. So I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. There are clues. I think this is part of God's grace that we see here, right? And his persistent presence. The law never gets lost, right? Daniel knows enough to go back and read Jeremiah and like resurrect the prophets and study them. Ezra has access to the law. He can study it and learn it, even though the people back home in Jerusalem don't really seem to be putting everything into place like they should.
Verse 17 brings out that it might be less of an example of them losing the law, and the fact that as years have gone by, the custom of following the law to the letter has simply gone by the wayside. And I mean, that's in Jesus' time is what we see, that the law just elected and loopholes for why they don't have to follow it to the letter. In verse 17, we see here the Feast of Booths has not been observed properly since Joshua. I mean, that's crazy. That's a really long time for where we supposedly have the full law and all these prophets and kings, and they're not doing it properly.
no, that's exactly
Right. It's hard to know exactly like what was lacking the whole time. It's not super exactly clear in verse 17, but the point there is they did it. Like however they said to do it, they did it. And something had not been a piece of that going all the way back to Joshua. So think about that, the life of David, right? I mean, when you think about that and we think, well, that seems like it was such a holy time. And David was a mess, but it seems like they were really earnestly trying to do the right things. Even throughout David's reign, something was lacking from the Feast of Booths here, that it would give rise to this first year. So they've come back, and Ezra just, right, he elevates this and says, we're going to do exactly what it says. Everyone's going to be involved.
right. That's why they're
Activity, because they weren't following the strict letter of the law.
right. That's really sad. That this is how the
Time we found God's people. Oh, look at what we found in the law. You know, like this is not the first time that they've lost some aspect of it.
I can't help but remember in 2 Kings, the first chapter, Ahaziah is sick and he's having health issues because of things that have happened. He calls upon the gods of the land. And so God's message to him is it because there's no God in Israel that you're going to call upon all these other gods? And I've got to wonder, was that kind of the same thing that's going on with
So just to bring all the different books of the Testament together, is a picture of what the majority of the Israelites were like when Jack taught Esther. That was a major point, was that it's pretty purposeful to see that we have the spirit of salvation, and yet nowhere in the book is mentioned is God or the law from the people who stayed behind, right? I feel like it's a pretty good image of probably what a majority of the Israelites were like at that time, both who stayed in Jerusalem and who were stayed behind in captivity. It just kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Pretty much all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I know we're out of time. Let me just put the cap on this, because this is also where we see the success of Ezra's mission. All right, so he stands up, he reads the law. There's a lot of weeping to go along with it. And in fact, the Levites have to go into the crowd and say, this is like, stop crying. You should be joyful at this, right? Go and be rejoicing. But you see here in verse 13 of chapter 8, it says, on the second day, the heads and fathers' houses of all the people with the priests and the Levites. By the way, those are the people who were engaged in intermarriage previously, came together to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. All right, so now we're seeing the leaders of the people, both civil and spiritual, coming to Ezra and being like, okay, we're back to study the law. Let's do this, right? And so Ezra has successfully planted this seed with the people that now they're coming to him, right? He doesn't have to go to them and condemn them, convict them. They're coming to him to get God's word, all right? So he can check the box, if you will, on that mission, right? Mission success. So now he's going to end us with the restoration of the law with the people as well, okay? We see played out in the Feast of Booths. Okay, thank you, everyone. Like I said, Nehemiah next Sunday. Read the whole book. That's your homework. And Tristan will be teaching that class.